pastor trick and ask for a show of hands. How many of you would say you have a love-hate relationship with technology? Most of us probably. Now, some of you just might have a hate relationship with technology. I completely understand if that's the case. Most of us would probably say we have a love-hate relationship with technology. It can be a blessing and a curse. Anytime there's a new technology, whether you're talking about, cavemen in the Stone Age and all of a sudden bronze came along, or the first invention of the telephone over 100 years ago, there is this kind of upheaval in society, and people don't know how to use that new technology, and it does change us. It changes the way we communicate. Just as a part of researching, I came across some conversations that people were having when the first telephone was invented, and this is what the early 20th century, and there were folks who were greatly disturbed that you could have a conversation with somebody without seeing them face to face. And how is that going to affect our relationships? And we kind of look back on that and maybe some of us laugh, but at the same time, they're right, correct? I mean, it does affect how we interact. And so anytime there is a new technology, we do have to adjust to it. And some of us have an easier time with that. Some of us don't want to. Some of us are more prone to see, no, I think there are problems here. I don't want to adjust to it. And so it can just create all kinds of feelings and responses when we have a new technology, and that's the kind of stuff we're talking about in this series. My guess is most of us would say we probably spend too much time looking at screens. And of course, look around. Here we are. I said I said this to somebody recently, I don't think Jesus cares about lights and screens, but Americans do. And so, there are communication devices that are just kind of expected, correct? But we probably feel like we spend too much time looking at screens, smartphones, computer monitors, TVs, etc. And there is a growing body of research about how that affects our brains, our attention spans, our emotional lives, and so on. We know for sure that technology does affect our relationships. Some of us may already suspect that we spend too much time on technology, maybe too much time, looking at this, even when we're with family members or friends, or maybe, we've got the blue tinted glasses because we know we spend so much time looking at computer screens. It's supposed to protect your eyes from light. We have definitely experienced both probably the positive aspects of technology, like during the pandemic, being able to have Zoom calls or Skype calls or FaceTime calls with people far away that we love. We couldn't travel. Man, what a blessing to be able to talk to them. And at the same time, we've seen the destructive potential of social media and propaganda on our relationships and sense of well-being. How many of you, we won't ask for a show of hands this time, had to essentially block or unfollow friends or family members because it almost got to be bullying, like online bullying about politics or the pandemic and all kinds of things. And we've seen what's happened in our society because of the extremes that we can encounter on social media and in technology. And next week we'll talk about some of the effect on teenagers as well as adults, but we know that technology and social media does affect our relationships and our well-being. And so during this series, we want to gain an understanding of how technology affects our lives, discover best practices for adjusting to this new world that we're living in, and most of all, learn how to improve our relationships and cultivate the healthiest relationships we can with the people we love. And here's the schedule of where we're headed. Today we're talking about technology, social media, and your stress level. Next week, technology, social media, and your view of yourself. We'll talk about body image, appearance. We'll also talk about comparing ourselves, how we feel about our lives and where we are in life and that kind of thing. April 30th, technology, social media, and your view of life and the world in general. May 7th, technology, social media, and your time. And then May 14th, which is Mother's Day, technology, social media, and your loved ones. And I want to say here at the beginning of the series, I'm thankful for many aspects of technology. I use technology every day. I'm active on social media. I have a smartphone. We have a nice TV in our house and computers, and we use all these things for church. We promote the church. We've essentially started the church through Facebook and Instagram. Many of you are here because of ads that you've seen, and so I'm thankful for many aspects of technology. And there are also reasons for concern. Somebody emailed me a few weeks ago and said, I hope during this series you'll talk about one option for relating to technology and social media is to not be on social media. And I do have some friends who are not. And they don't want to use a smartphone. They really want to limit their time, and they're not on Facebook, and they're not on Instagram, and I do think that's a valid option. I know people who have just said, if I get on that, I'll just get sucked in. I know where it's going to lead me. And so that may be one option for you. For me, there are aspects that I appreciate, but we want to be able to use technology and social media in a healthy way. So we are living in a brave new world, especially because of these things here. Smartphones. Now, a phone used to be something that we left in a house. And maybe it was on the wall, or maybe it was on the kitchen counter, and then there was this amazing invention of a cordless phone, and you could walk around and talk. And it was like a brick, slightly larger and had an antenna. And then there were phone booths at the gas station. If you needed to call somebody, you could drop a coin. I found a meme this week that I appreciated. It says, "Kids exploring ancient ruins." It's from a long-lost civilization back in the 1900s. Does anybody remember this time when a phone was something completely different than what it means now? A phone, it means something different to our lives now. Here's some basic stats about how much we use technology, specifically smartphones and social media. Our constant connection to smartphones has given rise to this term. I don't know how many of you know this. Nomophobia. Has anybody heard this term? No mobile phone phobia. It's the fear of not having your phone. Now, how many of you, if you're honest, would be like, I think I have that a little bit? Nomophobia. Oh, I forgot my phone. I got to go back and get my phone. Where's my phone? Anybody see my phone? Nomophobia, the fear of being without your phone. Here's some average, or some basic stats from Tech Jury. The average smartphone owner unlocks their phone 150 times a day. Now, that seems pretty high. At the same time, though, most Americans think they're above average drivers. We don't know until we actually count. If that may be closer to the truth than what you think. Using smartphones for longer intervals of time changes brain chemistry. There are studies about the effects of technology on our brains. 66% of the world's population shows signs of nomophobia, the fear of not having their phone. 71% of people usually sleep with or next to their mobile phone. I get next to. Sleeping with, that's a different kind of story. But smartphone and social media use are correlated with depression and anxiety. Being constantly interrupted by alerts and notifications may be contributing towards a problematic deficit of attention. The same study found that almost half of teenagers feel the pressure to respond to notifications instantly. They feel that there's a pressure there. Oh, I have to respond. Maybe you feel the same way. My mic's a little hot. You can bring it down. My voice carries. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, you can bring it down a little bit. That's okay. 80% of smartphone users check their phone within 1 hour of waking up or going to sleep. 1/3 of that said within 5 minutes of waking up or going to sleep. Screen time is the third most frequent source of conflict between parents and teens behind chores and bedtime. We spend an average of 147 minutes daily on social media, and then this is my favorite. We save the best for last. 75% of Americans use their mobile phones on the toilet. So when somebody says, "Here, can you hold my phone?" the answer is no. That gives new meaning to the term, hold the phone. No, thank you. I don't think I want to do that. Also, I think 25% of Americans are lying. Can I get an amen? So we won't ask for a show of hands for that one. But we are tied to technology, aren't we? Most of us. And so for those who say, no, I don't want to use it, that's a valid option. For those who do, we want to learn how to live wisely with technology and social media. And so today we're starting with technology, social media, and your stress levels. It goes without saying that your stress level affects not only how you feel, but it affects how you relate to other people. It affects how you relate to your loved ones. Whether you're irritable with them or impatient with them or you're just kind of in a mood or in a funk around the people you love, our stress level certainly affects that. And so I remember back in 2020, and I know when I say that, most of us like, I would rather not remember back to 2020. But I remember how I would pick up my phone and get online and read about the news, what was happening, the pandemic and the presidential election. And I was one of those people who would get up within 5 minutes. I was on Twitter or Facebook, scrolling through, and I would scroll through before bed I was trying to keep up on what was happening. And I had this feeling like the more I'm informed, like I couldn't quite articulate it, but the better off I'll be. Like I just need to know what's happening. I just need to be informed about what's going on in the world and trying to understand how half of the country could support the things that they were supporting and wondering, why my friends and family are saying these things and then scrolling through horrific, depressing news first thing in the morning and then before going to bed and it was almost like, somehow if I just almost compulsively read all this stuff, somehow the safer I'll be and the better I'll feel, the more in control I'll feel about the world. It sounds like a recipe for living well, doesn't it? But I remember feeling that way, and then I discovered this term that I've shared here before and that you've heard, doom scrolling. And there was this phenomenon that actually got some study time of feeling like we're threatened, and if I can just consume more information, especially negative stuff, if I can read all the bad news, somehow I'll feel better. I'll feel safer. I'll feel less threatened. It was messing with our survival instincts. Where are we going as a country? What's happening? Is my family going to be okay? Am I going to be okay? And the more bad news we consumed, the better we could feel about that. And last year, the National Institute of Health published an article entitled "Doom Scrolling Scale: Its Association with Personality Traits, Psychological Distress, Social Media Use," easy for me to say, "and Well-Being." It said, without a doubt, certain stimuli like pandemics and outbreaks lead individuals to get stuck in uncontrollable and uncomfortable thoughts, which can be eased by getting related answers about the unknown. This urge to get all the facts to protect ourselves from danger and to have a feeling of control over it has kept us engaged with scrolling our phones long hours for more information and news, which are primarily negative. Constant exposure to negative news on social media and news feeds could take the form of doom scrolling, which is commonly defined as a habit of scrolling through social media and news feeds where users obsessively seek for depressing and negative information. I thought, who's been watching me? They know somehow. Moreover, since the online platforms are well aware of what captivates us most by using algorithmic systems, they serve us with the content that will get our attention, considering our previous history on the internet. Oh, are you looking for all the bad news you can possibly find? Here's more. That's how social media works. And I saw that taking place in my life. And then there's another term I came across, and I hadn't heard this one before, but it's the term headline anxiety. Doesn't that make instant sense? Headline anxiety. Last year, the American Psychological Association published an article on headline anxiety and media overload, being constantly bombarded by negative news, negative headlines on Facebook, Twitter, etc. And they cited a study finding that there's a link between daily exposure to negative news and more depression and PTSD symptoms. So the study found, but an emotional correlation wasn't identified among adults who relied more on traditional media sources, such as newspapers or television for news. Price said, Dr. Price conducted this study. He said that the heightened effect with social media sites might be embedded in the way they use news to reel in and retain their users. They're designed to be limitless scrolling, he said. When there's a big news-related topic of conversation that's negative, it can dominate what you're seeing. It can give, and this is the key, it can give the impression that this is the only thing that's happening. So when they conducted this study, they found that TV news and newspapers did not produce the same depressive and traumatic effects, the same level of stress and anxiety that consuming negative news on social media produced, because it's limitless. How many of you use TikTok? 3 of you are willing to admit you're on TikTok. If you've ever been on TikTok, none of you have apparently, but I'll just share with you. You can just scroll forever. And the video. And there was somebody who told me they got on TikTok, and they're like, yeah, let me check this out. But it's a few minutes before bed, and they're like, 2 hours later, I realized, oh my goodness, it's like a casino. It's just limitless scrolling, and there's just negative news. And so for most of us, we wake up in the morning, and at some time during your morning, you get on Facebook or Twitter or whatever it is, and you read horrible story after horrible story. A dad shoots his children and turns the gun on himself. A video of 18,000 cows being burned alive on a farm in Texas. That happened. Was it Friday? Yet another school shooting with innocent children gunned down in their classrooms. A politician is being indicted and his followers won a civil war. And then you think, okay, what's for breakfast? That's the way we start our morning, bombarded by this limitless scrolling ability and seeing negative news. And we begin our day like this, and the Price study is saying what is happening now for the first time in human history is that this limitless scrolling and feed of negative news is giving us the impression that this is what's happening, that this is all that's happening in the world. This is what the world is like. This is what life is like. That's the effect that it's having on our brains. He didn't use this term, but what it means is we are guinea pigs. For the first time in human history, we are experiencing a limitless feed of negative news about the world using algorithms that feeds to us what we're prone to click on anyway. And it gives our brains the impression that this is the world, this is life. And human beings, the human brain, did not develop in that kind of world. We are not made for that experience. Now imagine if there was no internet and social media. Now for some of us, that's called the first half of our lives. So you can imagine what that time was like. Do you remember? It can be kind of hard to remember sometimes, can't it? How it felt differently. See, I remember when I was a little guy and I lived with my grandparents and my mom until I was 6, I remember my grandpa watching the nightly news with Tom Brokaw. And yeah, Tom Brokaw fans over there, that's right. And it was on from 6 to 6:30 p.m. And so for a half an hour, yeah, it was pretty negative news, what was going on in the world. But then it was over. It was a half an hour, and then it was time for Wheel of Fortune and Jeopardy. And that's all you got. Now, there were newspapers, of course, but newspapers aren't limitless. Newspapers don't come with HD videos of the horrible thing that happened. And if there was bad news, the kind of stuff that we're used to seeing in our feeds all the time now before breakfast, that was something that happened in your town. Maybe some kind of weird freak event would happen every few years that you would hear about that would affect your life personally or your friends. And like, oh, isn't that a tragedy? Did you hear what happened to the Jones family? Yeah, it's terrible. But it wasn't like 10 of those before breakfast. It was just every once in a while. That's how the human brain developed in little villages, huddled around fires at night before going to sleep in our tents or whatever. That's how the human brain developed, not exposed to every bad thing that's happening in the world in real time in HD or 4K. Our brains didn't develop in the kind of world that we live in. And so Price is saying our brains don't know how to handle that. And our brains think that's what the world is really like. That's all that's happening in the world. Now, imagine, those of you who are like my age and older, imagine if you had no memory of a world before this. And we'll talk a little bit more about that next week and the effect that has on younger people. But it's no wonder that smartphones and social media use, the more you use it, the higher the correlation with depression and anxiety. It's no surprise. Now, maybe your anxiety is around comparing yourself to other people or how other people treat you. Maybe they bully you. You could be young or you could be older and you've had family members essentially bullying you online. Maybe it's a fear that you're missing out, FOMO, fear of missing out, or you're comparing yourself to other people, or you feel like other people look down on you or mistreat you. Maybe your anxiety from social media and tech comes primarily from that. We're going to talk more about that next week. For today, maybe your anxiety is based on all this tragic, negative news that we see constantly, headline anxiety, or the way that your family and friends spread sometimes false information on social media and how it affects you. Maybe your anxiety around social media is connected to politics and how some people in the U.S. are conducting themselves, or the future of America. Let's just pretend. I know it's a stretch. But let's just pretend that your anxiety comes from that. We'll focus on that kind of headline anxiety today. And if that's true for you, I find this scripture to be helpful that I want to share with you today. It comes from Psalm 94. How many of you realize that the Psalms are way more honest than a lot of Christians feel they can be about their lives? Like maybe you go to a church small group and everybody's doing great and nobody has anything, too vulnerable to share. Maybe that's the kind of church atmosphere that you're used to. I don't think that's the kind of atmosphere we cultivate here, but everybody's good, everybody's great. But how many of you realize in the Psalms you can get gut level honest? The psalm writers would talk about the highs and the lows, the full range of human emotions, the full range of the human experience, the joys and the pains and the anxiety and the jubilation. All those things are found in the Psalms. And this is one of those Psalms that for me just kind of describes the time that we live in. And I wanted to focus on a couple things here today. If you think of the anxiety you feel as, man, what's going on in the world is so disturbing, and the headline anxiety and the tragedies and the political games and all this stuff and the way my family and friends are acting. Let's read Psalm 94 together. The Lord is a God who avenges. O God who avenges, shine forth. Rise up, judge of the earth, pay back to the proud what they deserve. It's pretty honest, right? Pretty honest emotion there. How long, Lord, how long will the wicked be jubilant? They pour out arrogant words. All the evildoers are full of boasting. They crush your people, Lord. They oppress your inheritance. They slay the widow and the foreigner and murder the fatherless. They just commit injustice all the time. They say the Lord does not see. The God of Jacob takes no notice. Take notice, you senseless ones among the people. Anybody feel like calling somebody a senseless one every once in a while? Take notice, you senseless ones among the people, you fools. When will you become wise? Does he who fashioned the ear not hear? Does he who formed the eye not see? Does he who disciplines nations not punish? Does he who teaches mankind lack knowledge? The Lord knows all human plans. He knows they are futile. Blessed is the one you discipline, Lord, the one you teach from your law. You grant them relief from days of trouble, till a pit is dug for the wicked. Oh, that's honest. That's honest feelings about what this psalm writer is experiencing. Verse 14, for the Lord will not reject his people. He will never forsake his inheritance. Judgment will again be founded on righteousness, and the upright in heart will follow it. Who will rise up for me against the wicked? Who will take a stand for me against evildoers? Unless the Lord had given me help, I would soon have dwelt in the silence of death. When I said, my foot is slipping, your unfailing love, Lord, supported me. When anxiety was great within me, your consolation or your comfort brought me joy. Can you identify with that psalm? Identify with the feelings there, the highs and the lows, evildoers, people saying senseless things, and all this injustice, and people boasting about it. And I see that at my social media feed every day, and I know people, friends and family, and it's just such an anxiety-producing experience. But somehow, I want to believe that I can find comfort. I can find consolation somehow in my relationship with God. And so what happens is in Psalm 94, the writer moves from anxiety to consolation. There's this progression throughout the psalm. And then a paraphrase might be, when I felt full of anxiety, your comfort gave me joy. And how this happens is the psalmist reminds himself or herself of God's character, who God is. God does not allow the proud and the evildoers to have their way forever. It goes on way longer than we think it should, and we get so sick of it and so tired of it, but God does not tolerate that forever. God does not allow injustice to reign forever. Martin Luther King Jr. said it like this: the arc of justice, or the arc of history is long, but it bends toward what? I gave it away. Justice. So God doesn't tolerate evil and wicked, boastful, evil people forever. And you might feel like, God, I just feel, I'm anxious and stressed out, and I can't even put it into words sometimes. And the psalm writer realizes, no, God's not going to reject me. God's not going to forsake people who want to do good things in the world, no matter how bad things seem. God sees the evil and injustice that is happening, and it will be dealt with. And at the same time, who will join with me, the writer writes. It's like, who will partner with God? When we say we've had enough, we don't want to see this anymore, we don't want to live like this, who will partner with God to make the world better, to do right, to bring justice, to make life better for everybody, to bring the truth out and not propaganda and proud lies? Who will partner with God to do that? And so it's this psalm writer's realization, this is who God is. God's character. And I can partner with God. That's what helps the psalm writer move from anxiety to comfort to joy. And so for the rest of the message, we're going to look at how to partner with God. Instead of feeling anxious, and tips for living wisely with tech and social media, and learn about an exercise for managing headline anxiety, if this is where your anxiety is coming from. So first of all, if you're a note taker, I just want to share some things with you. If you're a note taker, you might want to jot them down. Let's say we stop doom scrolling and we limit our time on social media. We're not on it all the time. We're not on it first thing in the morning. Does that mean that we should just be uninformed? That we don't know what's going on in the world, and we just kind of live blindly, and ignorance is bliss? Is that the way we want to live? No, I don't think it is. We want to be informed and involved. The psalm writer is informed about what's going on in the world. They're not living under a rock. They know what's going on. But we have to continually remind ourselves there's a difference between being anxious and being engaged. Does that help at all? There's a difference between being filled with anxiety about what's going on in the world and being engaged, partnering with God to make it better. There's a difference about those two things, or between those two things. The psalmist cares about what's going on in the world. That's what the whole psalm's about. It's just that knowing who God is and partnering with God relieves the psalmist's stress and brings joy. So you can be informed, but not anxious and stressed out over what we are experiencing. There's a difference between being anxious, personally anxious, and being engaged in partnering with God. And I want to use as an example of that one of the most difficult subjects we could talk about, one of the most emotional subjects we could talk about. And this is a church that values thoughtfulness, and we say in our mission statement, we want to be a spiritual home for thinking, compassionate people. And so this is an opportunity where we can just kind of talk as adults and have a nuanced discussion about something as adults. And so the incredibly difficult emotional topic of gun violence, and particularly mass shootings in school. And the latest, at least as far as I know, because they seem to happen once a week, but the latest example was this horrific, tragic shooting in Nashville. And this was a little private Christian school in Nashville, and every time this happens, of course, it makes headlines for a couple of days, and then kind of goes away, nothing changes, and then it happens again. Am I correct about that cycle? Is that how it works? And now I'm of the opinion that we do need solutions, because doing nothing isn't working. And I believe that one more child being lost in a senseless, preventable way like this is completely unnecessary, and it's an indictment on society and our political system, and it needs to be addressed. Now, there are people who point out that, and accurately, that the chances of you and I or somebody we love being involved in a mass shooting are small. There are 335 million people, I think, in America. And these shootings, as common as they are, compared to 335 million people, the chances of it happening to you are small. And so should you walk around feeling personally anxious, afraid that you might get shot or that your child might get shot? Should it be overcome with anxiety? No, you shouldn't. Now, we pay a security guard here, and we're forming a security team, and you always have to take precautions in the kind of day and age that we live in. Should you walk around feeling personally anxious? Well, no. There's a difference, though, between being anxious and being engaged. Let me ask it this way. What's the percentage chance that more school children will be shot to death in their classroom somewhere in America during the remainder of 2023? That answer should enrage us and make us want to vomit all at the same time. Probably 100%. Sick. So, do you need to walk around feeling personally anxious that you or somebody you love will be in a mass shooting? Percentage chances? No. But does that mean that you shouldn't be engaged and you shouldn't care? No. There's a difference between being personally anxious and getting engaged. Now, there are people who think, well, and this is how it usually gets stated, if the chances are so low that I or somebody I love would be involved in a mass shooting, then I don't need to do anything about it. That's called selfishness. That's living under a rock. Well, it doesn't affect me, so it's not a problem that needs to be dealt with. That's not something that a follower of Jesus Christ has the privilege of saying. That's not who we're called to be. And then on the other hand, there are people who think that in order to be engaged and do something about an issue, that they have to feel personally anxious all the time in addition to getting engaged. So I have to go through life, living in fear that it's going to happen today to me, or I can't get engaged. And that's not true either. There's a difference between being personally anxious about something and being engaged. Does that make sense? Boy, that was quiet. Does that help at all? There's a difference between being full of stress and anxiety that, oh my gosh, this is going to happen to me or my loved one today. Well, the chances of that are slim. But then at the same time, it's going to happen to somebody. It's going to happen again. Of course it is. And we need to do something about it, because one more child lost to this is ridiculous. And so we're going to get involved. We don't need to be personally anxious about it, no, but we're going to be engaged. And so the way you do that, in my opinion, is you vote. Social media clicks don't count in elections. Voting counts, and you get involved, and you roll up your sleeves, and you do something about an issue. You don't have to be personally filled with anxiety about it to be engaged, and you can do something about it. And the psalmist says, and I'm paraphrasing, that partnering with God and getting engaged will decrease your anxiety and also bring you joy. I have typo fever recently, but you don't have to be personally anxious about something in order to get engaged. And in fact, getting engaged and doing something to address these issues, doing something about the disturbing things we read. Now, you can't do something about everything. You can't be involved in every cause. But if there's something that speaks to your heart, actually doing something relieves stress. Because now we're not just reading a headline and trying to forget it, but now we're actually doing something to be a part of the solution. And I can partner with God to make the world better. And the psalmist says that partnering with God is a part of God comforting me and bringing me joy. It brings joy when you know that you're doing something to prevent senseless death and destruction. You're actually getting involved. Anxiety doesn't save lives, but getting engaged will, and that brings joy. And then how do we live wisely with tech and social media when it doesn't come to just getting engaged in something, but being exposed to it in the first place? There are things there are habits that many of us fall into, and they cause anxiety, and it's easy to understand why they do, but they're habits, and so we just kind of fall into these habits, and we don't realize what it's doing to us. And as Dr. Price says, our brains can't handle it, and we feel anxiety that comes from it. Well, there are some tips that I compiled from reading several mental health sites, and we can share those about how to deal with anxiety at the root and the way we interact with these things. First is to track your tech time for a day. To track the time that you spend on a smartphone or desktop, if you use that, and specifically on social media. Now, how many of you have ever sat down to make a budget and you kind of had a hypothetical budget, Like, this is how much money I spend eating out every month. And then you actually tracked it. Anybody ever had that experience? I remember a few years ago, Hannah and I were making a budget, and it was, okay, here's like the first draft. Here's what we think we spend eating out, and we tracked what we spent eating out. And it was like more than double what we thought it was. And so it's easy to just dismiss this and think, I don't need to track it. I don't spend that much time on there. Like we said, most Americans think they're above average drivers, and the same thing with trying to lose weight and counting calories. If you really want to lose weight, and of course you consult your doctor, but for me, it's about a caloric deficit. You eat less calories than you burn, and you have to kind of have an idea of how many calories you're consuming. And the reason you count is you end up consuming way more calories than you think you do, unless you actually count. So I took my own advice here, and this past Friday, I counted the amount of time that I spent using my phone and social media. Would you like to know how much time I spent? I'm not telling you because I'm embarrassed. I am literally embarrassed to tell you how much time I spent on Facebook and Instagram and just unlocking this thing. I paid attention to it. I believe that average of 150 times unlocking the phone every day. I wasn't quite there, but I'm embarrassed to tell you. I'm embarrassed to tell you how much money we spent eating out. And you'll probably have that experience if you do this. Actually track your time. If you're feeling anxiety, this is well worth your time. The times that we live in, track your time for a day. And kind of know what your habits are, and at least you'll know. And then second was to experiment with a social media fast. If you're struggling with tech and social media anxiety, you might try fasting, maybe just for a day. I'm just not going to use social media for a day. Or I'm not going to Google the news, and I'm certainly not going to watch cable news, whatever. I'm just going to fast for a day, or maybe it's a week. I have a friend who did a social media fast for 30 days. And at the end of 30 days, who is shocked to hear that they said, man, I feel so much better and less stressed, and this was totally eye-opening. Anybody surprised to hear that? No, I don't think so. And so try a social media fast even for a day. Third, in this number of websites that I consulted, they advised to exercise discernment about the news you consume. Now, I started this when I realized I was doom scrolling. And I started actually before the pandemic. I remember giving a sermon about this where I got rid of my quote-unquote cable news apps. I don't really watch TV, but I'll watch things on YouTube, or I had apps on my phone that are of news outlets that are really more opinion-based. And I'm not going to consume, quote-unquote, news from those outlets. If I consume news, it's going to be from a news source that at least tries to be objective, or there's more than one opinion presented. A friend of mine who's a little more on the conservative end asked me recently what I think about Ben Shapiro. And he thinks that Ben Shapiro is an intellectual. And he said, I think he's an intellectual guy. And it's easy in the times we live in to just come back with some pithy comment, correct? And so proud of myself, this time I was able to kind of step back and I said, well, what does listening to him do for you in your life? And I was kind of proud of myself. Isn't that a good question? I was proud that I just didn't start hurling insults or something. And he kind of struggled to answer it. And to be honest, I've consumed news that's one-sided before. I know you can kind of get sucked in. But what does that do for your life? And then he kind of hemmed and hawed. He said, well, at least I'm more informed about what's going on. Now, let me stop you there. There's a difference between news and opinion. There's a difference between information and somebody selling you something. And so you pick your talking head, whoever it is, there's a difference between news and opinion. And so if you want to be informed, you can access news that offers you no opinion or that offers you differing opinions. Now, sometimes you can get into these weird false equivalents, both sidesism things, and that's not helpful. Our media struggles with that. But we can exercise discernment about the quote-unquote news we consume, because I'll say one more thing and then I'll stop there. Part of the way that a lot of these opinion-based hosts make millions and millions and millions of dollars is that they sell outrage. They make you angry. They turn you into a rageaholic, basically, and kind of radicalize you, even though we don't like to use those terms. And then they sell you books. And then, of course, they sell sponsorships to their shows. And so the more viewers they get, the more money they make. And so here's how it really works. They infect you with the disease, and then they sell you the cure. And so you want to exercise discernment about the quote-unquote news you consume. And then fourth, if you have children, you want to talk with them about tech and social media and set limits. Next week, we'll talk more about this. Next week is aimed at adults primarily, but we're going to talk about teenagers and the effect of tech and social media on teenagers. It is highly destructive effects. And so you want to have a talk with them. Doesn't mean you make them Amish, but it means you have a talk with them and you can set limits. And then fifth, you don't want to use tech or social media first thing in the morning or right before you go to bed. There are other sites that said it's just a good idea to set some rules. No cell phones in your bedroom or at the kitchen table. And depressing news in the morning is a horrible way to start your day with grief and adrenaline, seeing these horrible news stories. Cell phone use also stimulates your brain, just the act of looking at pixels of light flying towards your brain stimulates your brain. It can make it harder to fall asleep. And then headline anxiety will obviously disturb your sleep. And then you want to create tech-free spaces in your home so you can spend time together. If you live with other people, you can spend time together and you don't have to have your time interrupted by technology. And then I love this one. Anytime you're with somebody, prioritize the person you're with. How many of you have had this experience? You're talking with somebody, you're out to lunch or whatever you are, and they get a call or a text, and then they're just like this. And you're like, wait a second, I'm still here, and they're kind of doing this. And yeah, there's pressure to respond to notifications, but it's almost like you kind of feel like, oh, now I know where I stand when you're with somebody. So the advice was, when you're with somebody, physically present with them, prioritize the person you're with. And make the technology secondary. Most calls and texts can wait. You don't have to respond immediately to every notification and prioritize the person you're with. I'm going to close with this story. This is a story of somebody named Amy Elay, who recognized that she was experiencing headline anxiety. That it wasn't the only thing stressing her out in life, but there was this anxiety from these social media habits, reading disturbing stories first thing in the morning and then before going to bed, that was just raising her baseline level of stress in her life, and it really started to have an effect on her. And she learned an exercise to reduce the stress that she felt from headline anxiety. Now, ironically, she works in TV, and she wrote this article during the pandemic, but it applies now just like it did 2 years ago. And she wrote, "My news feed makes me panic daily. But here's how I'm trying to fight it. I see stories every day of people like me facing my worst nightmares. And it makes me feel like my number will be up at any moment." And she said, as she went through the pandemic, she started feeling this more and more and more. And maybe your anxiety or stress levels aren't to this point, but maybe you can at least identify to some degree. She said, I would read some news story, especially about she's a mom and she has kids, and some horrible, tragic thing that happened to a family or a child. And she said, I would feel like an elephant was sitting on my chest. That's usually how it starts. It may happen while I'm sitting in my office and see a post pop up in my Facebook feed, for example, of a young child who's missing. Or I become inundated with coronavirus content, and I think of, how am I going to take care of my family if something like this happens to me? Or I'll be sitting on my sofa after work and checking out the Instagram feed, and I see a photo of a young parent with cancer. And I think, what if that happened to me? What would my children do if that happened to me? And my heart would start to race. And I would start to feel a sense of panic. Now, maybe, again, yours isn't that extreme of a result, but at least, this has an effect on her anxiety levels. And as she scrolls, she sees one heartbreaking headline and tragic experience after another. And like Dr. Price, she wrote this: "There's no perspective on social media. The odds of it happening to me are low. but the odds of me seeing it on Facebook are so high that I forget that Facebook is telling me about a 1 in a million case. And so she reached out to this therapist named Tiffany Rowe in Utah, and she says, ironically, she saw Tiffany on social media, but she reached out to her, and this counselor, Tiffany, told her, well, first of all, you're not alone. Let's start with the obvious. You're not alone. She said this oversaturation, overexposure, constant information stimulation, it obviously is a natural outcome of anxiety here. Studies are showing what is really common sense at this point. You're not alone. And Amy explained to the therapist, like most people, I can't just quit social media. I have to be on it for my job, actually. But how can I still use it without it heightening my sense of anxiety or sending me into a panic at times? And so Tiffany, the therapist, gave Amy this exercise, and I'll end with this. If you're feeling headline anxiety and you can identify with the feelings of the psalm writer in Psalm 94, well, first of all, we want to partner with God and get engaged. But then she said, you want to acknowledge what you're feeling. When you come across one of these tragic posts, and we see probably 25 or 50 a day, if you're kind of the average scroller, maybe more, and one of those really hits you hard, well, first of all, you acknowledge what you're feeling. You stop scrolling and you say, I'm feeling this. And Amy gave the example of seeing a mother who was dying, and she said, what if I die? And what if I get taken from my children? What are my children going to do? And so she said, I'm just going to acknowledge what I'm feeling. I'm feeling fear. I'm feeling anguish. I'm feeling pain from reading this. And then step 2 is you validate the feelings. You remind yourself that it's okay to have feelings. You're a human being. And so, of course, you're going to have an emotional response to some horrible thing. That's what we've been desensitized to thinking. We see it so much. We don't realize seeing some grievous, horrible story. No, of course it's going to affect the way we feel. And so she said, use affirmative language. It's okay to feel this. My emotions are valid. Of course I feel this. Of course I feel this after reading this tragic thing. And then the big step, she said, was 3, to dig deeper. The therapist, Tiffany Rowe, encouraged Amy to ask herself, is there a deeper fear here? Is there something that this particular headline or story is speaking to? Or maybe my family posted something. Is there something deeper here that this hits? The fear that this could happen to me, or why is this particular content affecting you as strongly as it is? And she said for her, she realized beyond being a mom and having kids and all this, she had a fear of death that she hadn't thought about much. She hadn't really grappled with her own mortality. And was just afraid of death and dying. And that was kind of the deeper issue for her that she was able to talk with the counselor about. And then lastly, the counselor said, you want to support yourself as you feel these things and as you work through your emotional life and how that's affecting you. Maybe it's journaling. Maybe it's spending a minute practicing gratitude. Here are the things I'm thankful about in my life, or reaching out to somebody for support, a counselor, a friend, taking a moment to acknowledge, I'm a human being. Of course I feel this way after reading this horrible thing, and I need a moment here. And it's okay to be human. And so she had this experience of reading this post and dug deeper and was asking, how do I support myself out of this? And she said she put her phone away and she talked herself through it, and she reminded herself that she's healthy and her children are healthy. And she said she reminded herself of the implausibility that would happen to her at this time, and her fears began to quiet, and the entire process only took a few minutes. To conclude, she wrote, it's now been about 3 weeks since I started practicing this exercise. I'm not healed of social media anxiety, nor do I think that was Tiffany Rowe's intent, but I do have a toolkit to use when those fears start to rise, and they do. And for the first time in a long time, I've remembered how to take care of myself instead of letting anxiety take hold of me. So I hope that is helpful in the world that we live in. So we are guinea pigs in this new experiment of this limitless feed of negative news bombarding us. And our brains are not designed for this. Of course we feel anxious. And so instead of living in that anxiety, first of all, we can remember the psalmist. We can partner with God. There's a difference between being anxious and being engaged. We can partner with God to get engaged and make this world better and address the problems that tempt us to be anxious. And we can also live wisely. limiting our time and being aware of when we use social media, tracking it and know our habits and break out of some of those. And then maybe an exercise like this, when we do feel that headline anxiety taking hold. And as the psalmist writes, we can say, your comfort brings me joy. Let's pray. God, thank you for not only the psalm writer and the willingness to be honest about their feelings of anxiety and how they could experience joy, but also others like Amy who are willing to share their experience and write about that with the world and tell their story. We're living in a time, oh God, in which our brains were not prepared for the kind of media onslaught that we've experienced. And it causes anxiety in us. And oh God, we don't want to live that way. It's not your will that we live in anxiety and stress and fear. You have something better for us. And like the psalm writer, we can begin with your character, that you are good. You don't tolerate the nonsense that we're seeing all around us forever. The arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. But we don't have to be victims of that because we can partner with you. We don't have to feel personally anxious. We can get engaged. And when it comes to these new technological platforms and so on, we can live wisely, we can limit our time, we can track our habits, we can make good decisions about when we expose our brains to this information and then how we can care for ourselves when we are affected. But God, we don't have to live with anxiety in this world we live in. As we work through this process more and more, oh God, we believe that we can say with the psalmist, your comfort brings me joy. We pray that for each one of us here in Jesus' name. And everybody said, amen. Amen.